Hello, my name is Lauren McCoy. I am an assistant professor at Winthrop University, and today I will be talking about the NCAA and Title IX. The purpose of this presentation is to kind of look to see whether or not there should be sanctions considered for with the NCAA to address sexual misconduct. And a lot of this has come out of recent sex abuse allegations and major cases, investigations where people have wondered if the NCAA could have done more to address those responses. Okay, so just really to start, this came about with the Larry Nassar and Michigan State University scandal. So, for those who aren't aware of what happened specifically with that, Larry Nassar is the former USA Gymnastics team doctor as well as a team doctor at Michigan State University who was sentenced to 40 to 175 years in prison after there were allegations of sexual assault against him with the victims numbering in the hundreds. He was fired by Michigan State University in September 2016, a month after the criminal complaint was filed against him, but initial complaints were reported against him at the university as far back as 1997 in his role as team doctor. Connected to this, there have been other individuals on campus who have been charged with criminal issues or criminal in charged in criminal cases, including Kathy Klages, the former women's gymnastics coach. She was found guilty of a felony and misdemeanor for denying knowledge of the abuse. She was the person who received that report in 1997. Additionally, Nassar's boss at Michigan State, ex-College of Osteopathic Medicine Dean William Strample, was sentenced to jail for crimes including neglecting a duty to enforce protocols on Nassar after a patient complained about sexual contact in 2014. Finally, the former MSU president, Luana Simon, was charged with lying to police and had her charges dropped in May 2020, though the prosecutor's office is currently considering appeal for those particular charges. So with this story, there was a history and a rampant issue associated with a lack of focus and intent on the actions of what was happening. Under Title IX, colleges and universities, schools as well, are supposed to prevent and promptly correct allegations of sexual harassment, including investigating when those reports are made. And it looks like here that there was some sort of deliberate indifference on the part of Michigan State because of the number of reports and the number of victims for Larry Nassar. So, just to kind of give a little bit more background of some of those initial lawsuits and investigations against the university, initially there was a lawsuit that was settled with some of the Nassar victims for $500 million in May 2018. There were 107 other women who did not settle in the initial round, and MSU did file a motion to dismiss that lawsuit in September of 2019, but they're still now working on towards settlements with that second wave of survivors because they did not win that particular motion. At this point, the total settlements for the university for these various victims has surpassed the original 500 million and could keep going as more and more victims come out. Now, really, as I said before, the focus on all of these claims is the institution's failure to respond to claims of abuse involving Larry Nassar. That first report was in 1997, but incidentally, there was also a complaint against him while he was still a medical student at Michigan State in 1992. Now, there's also been complaints that were investigations by the Michigan Attorney General's office, as well as the Department of Education and the NCAA. The Department of Education and NCAA investigations are complete, and I will talk about those more in just a little bit. However, with the Michigan Attorney General's office, they claim that their investigation is currently stalled because they are seeking documentation from the university that they still haven't received yet, in terms of some of those procedures and processes and essentially who knew what and what was done at the time. So really, there's a lot of deliberate indifference, or at least based on the Title IX definition of deliberate indifference, and a failure to respond to these particular claims of abuse. So that's really what the focus here is looking at how the institutions that are responsible for governing Michigan State University, as well as other institutions, how they have responded to these particular allegations and how they've held the university responsible for this failure to respond to these claims of abuse. So, with the U.S. Department of Education, they fined Michigan State $4.5 million for systemic failures to address sexual abuse committed by Nassar. This was really focused on the Clery Act noncompliance and the university's failure to report. Secretary DeVos at the time said, "What happened at Michigan State University was abhorrent. The crimes for which Larry Nassar and former Michigan State Dean William Strample have been convicted are disgusting and unimaginable. So too was the university's response to their crimes. This must not happen again there or anywhere else." So the university was found to also have violated Title IX in these two investigations. One was conducted by the Office of Civil Rights and the other by the Office of Federal Student Aid. Now, the fine, as I mentioned here, is part of a settlement where Michigan State did not admit any liability or wrongdoing, but as a result, they have to establish a new office dedicated to complying with federal regulations and also create a system of protective measures and expanded reporting to better ensure the safety of students and minor children who visit the campus. So that includes making substantial changes to the university's Title IX procedures to ensure that certain officials recuse themselves from Title IX matters to leave it specifically to a Title IX office. Also included is reviewing the actions of current and former employees of the university who had noticed but failed to take appropriate action in response to the reports of sexual misconduct and consider sanctions against those employees, as well as addressing the campus climate around issues of sexual harassment and sexual violence, strengthen staff training, and assess the need for additional student services. And then finally, to exercise adequate Title IX oversight over the university's youth programs by notifying youth program participants of its Title IX grievance procedures and that the procedures apply to those youth programs as well. So this is an interesting investigation in the fact that prior to the public report of the abuse by Larry Nassar, Michigan State had already been under investigation or under a U.S. Department of Education order based on some of their other Title IX issues in the past. And they had actually tried to get their oversight reduced, saying that they had done everything that they needed to comply with the law at that time, and then all of this came out. So a lot of the harshness for the fine could be connected to that because, they had already basically they'd already been dinged on some of these issues and then continued to fail to address them over the years in the name of covering up or failing to address some of these issues. So really what the U.S. Department of Education is trying to do is to make sure that they had the appropriate people in activities in place to be able to address these issues. In comparison, the Ncaa sent a letter of inquiry to Michigan State University citing Article 2.2 and Bylaw 20.9.1.6 as their basis of their investigation into Michigan State and Larry Nassar. This article does not actually address sexual harassment or assault. It's based on the specific institutional obligations to protect student athletes' well-being, including health and safety. So you could make the argument that sexual assault does apply, but it would be kind of a tenuous argument because it is not specifically addressed within that particular aspect or that particular article. Now, bylaw 20.9.1.6, on the other hand, does highlight requirements for the overall environment, but it doesn't produce any sort of measurable provisions when it comes to sexual harassment or assault. So the fact that the Ncaa concluded in August 2018 that there were no violations of Ncaa legislation that happened here at Michigan State with Larry Nassar, it's not surprising because the Ncaa rules at the time did not address sexual violence or abuse. Essentially, after the Sandusky scandal, there was no update to include any sort of provisions related to institutional responsibility for reporting sexual violence and abuse, at least to the point where there were sanctions for failure to do so. And as a result, not wanting to put themselves in another situation where there'd be a reversal of infractions for failure to actually have any rules to uh, relate to the situation, the NCAA just decided to say that there was no violation. So part of the problem here is that many of the member institutions that would help create some of these rules may not actually want those harsh punishments to address this behavior based on their own issues with Title IX compliance. As an example, the recent LSU report that was released at the first week of March, it sets a good example there because it's another institution with a series of incidents that seem to be related to a failure to address Title IX. In fact, they had one Title IX coordinator for all 9 campuses, which, to really do the job effectively, they would need at least one Title IX coordinator per campus to be able to investigate and report. So, you see some of the potentials for deliberate indifference, whereas, and explains why some officials may not want, or some member institutions may not want increased rules related to sexual assault and sexual violence connected to the NCAA, because that's would potentially create troubles for them as well. So, in response to kind of some of these conflicting results, there were a lot of calls for the NCAA to be more effective at supporting student athletes beyond eligibility concerns. And the reason for this is because the NCAA is the front-facing institution when we're talking about college athletics, and this scandal was directly connected to college athletics, considering this is a team employee of the athletics department. Uh, Rachel Den Hollander, who was one of the first people to report against Larry Nassar in terms of the criminal trial, said that if the NCAA legislation does not prohibit coaches from threatening consequences if a victim reports abuse, asking their athletes to sign a card for someone jailed on child sex abuses, or lying to police, then perhaps the NCAA needs to revisit their own legislation. And a lot of that could be referring to what happened with former women's gymnastics coach Kathy Klages, who essentially told athletes to not report against him, Dr. Nassar, at the time. A former captain of this MSU gymnastics team also said, if the world's worst pedophile in history working at Michigan State University and getting away with abuse for 20 years isn't considered a violation, then what is the point? So, the NCAA has set itself up in a position to be essentially the moral authority when it comes to college athletics, for better or worse. And as a result of that, people are looking for the NCAA to address these particular concerns. So, if you're going to govern these schools and universities and create rules that they need to follow, then why are we not doing it here? Now, some of the argument that they might say is that the reason why they're not is because it is connected to federal laws, so the law should be really the focus and not the NCAA. But there is still this kind of popular push publicly to have the NCAA legislation change to be better able to address some of these concerns. So, in relation to that, in December 2019, there was a new Congressional Advisory Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics Act that was introduced by Representatives Donna Shalala and Representative Spano. So, with this, they had a call to create a commission to investigate and review the relationship between higher education institutions and intercollegiate athletic departments. So, for example, they said that college sports, as overseen by the NCAA, have undergone a massive transformation in the recent years. This was a statement that was obtained by Athletic Business. As profits, compensation for coaches, and spending on luxurious athletic facilities have ballooned, the association has repeatedly failed to address systemic problems with respect to health and with with respect to the health and well-being of student athletes. And that was said by Donna Shalala, who happens to be a former president of the University of Wisconsin and the University of Miami. Now, with this, she did note the difference between athletic conferences and the NCAA, saying that the conferences had more of a hands-on approach. However, at the time of this announcement, many athletic conferences did not have similar protections when it came to sexual assault available, though there were some that did have specific rules related to transfer students and transfer students who had been accused of sexual abuse or violence at their previous institution. So this commission was going to address many areas associated with college athletics, including financial aid, participation, but also to see how exactly they're addressing these Title IX complaints in a manner that would allow for due process protections, with the purpose of submitting a final report to Congress to see exactly how these areas are being currently managed. Now, as a response to this and other issues, uh, let's talk about kind of the NCAA's policy at the time and now where it stands. So, the NCAA sexual violence policy, when these calls were made in 2019, 2018, had this focus on education without necessarily any sanctioning abilities. That was probably likely due to the resources available as well as the difficulties connected with investigating these claims. As I mentioned before, part of Title IX requirements are for institutions to have a Title IX coordinator, so that way they have an individual with expertise in this area in charge of investigations. With the NCAA, however, the employees tend to be devoted to policy making, but this requires better knowledge and enforcement, and doesn't seem to be anyone that's at least higher up at the NCAA with the ability to specifically address this, because it hasn't necessarily been something that they've needed to address at the time. So the initial sexual violence policy, which was created in 2018, reiterates a school's responsibility under Title IX. It requires coaches, athletes, college athletes, and athletics administrators to complete a sexual violence prevention education every year. However, it does not provide an avenue for sanctions for failure to comply with the policy. Really, what it was doing was already readdressing the institutional obligations under Title IX as well as the Clery Act, and making sure that there's some sort of extra enforcement available for that. Now, that policy, as I mentioned, has recently changed. It was updated in April 2020. Part of this could have been prompted by the Nassar investigation, or the lack of penalties associated with that particular investigation, along with a 2019 USA Today network investigation that exposed how college athletes were able to continue playing after being found responsible for sexual assault, which they called the predator pipeline. And essentially, what was happening under this particular pipeline is that student athletes were able to transfer to new universities while the adjudication process associated with their sexual violence claims, or the things that would eventually get them expelled from the university, while that procedure was still going on, and as a result they were able to essentially escape or avoid that particular punishment. So with this new policy, they added three items 4 through 6, which required starting with the 2023 academic year. Under the new policy, all incoming, current, and transfer college athletes must disclose annually to their school whether their conduct has resulted in an investigation, discipline through a Title IX proceeding, or a criminal conviction for sexual, interpersonal, or other acts of violence. Failure by the athlete to accurately and fully disclose that investigatory activity, or criminal conviction, may result in penalties, including the loss of their athletics eligibility as determined by the school. So first you have that new student athlete disclosure form. You also have that the institutions need to take reasonable steps to confirm whether those athletes have been under investigation. So you have self-reporting as well as investigation in terms of the university for any sort of incoming or transfer students. You also have the institution needing to, if they're going to recruit or a prospective student athlete or accept a transfer, they have to have a written policy that directs staff to gather information on from the former institution on the student athlete. That was essentially one of the things that was exposed with that predator pipeline, is that a lot of the schools were relying on the basic information uploaded by the transfer student without actually contacting the schools to see how much of that information was the truth, whether or not there was any of these allegations against them. So under items 4 and 6, there could be penalties against the athlete or the university. Specifically under item 6, failure to accurately and fully disclose that investigatory activity, disciplinary action, or criminal conviction could result in some of those penalties, like a loss of eligibility to participate in athletics, as well as fines against the institution. So they would potentially be prohibited from hosting an NCAA championship for the next applicable new year or athletic year as well. All of this comes back to kind of where the NCAA has liability under Title IX. Now, as we know, Title IX of the Education Amendments Act of 1972 applies to educational programs and activities that are receiving federal financial assistance, and that includes any part of that organization that's receiving that money. However, it has to be a direct receipt of that money to the overall organization. And since the NCAA isn't a direct recipient, they are not subject to Title IX, which was a ruling made in NCAA v. Smith by the U.S. Supreme Court. So really, we've got kind of a little bit of a conundrum here, because we have a governing organization that's not subject to the same rules as the schools and universities that it governs. How exactly do we cover that distance? Because the NCAA technically does not have to create any sort of rules related to Title IX compliance, because they don't actually, or they are not actually subject to Title IX compliance. All the universities and schools within the NCAA are, so they should be able to address that on their own without the NCAA adding extra governance or extra rulemaking associated to something that the schools are already permitted or required to do on their own. However, the NCAA is that public-facing moral authority, and it looks very suspect when you have this group not addressing this particular issue. Not only that, it providing an avenue to be able to let schools potentially escape through this. So, especially with that whole idea of the predator pipeline, where they were using the NCAA transfer portal to not disclose that particular information. Now, that particular loophole has now been closed up with these new items associated with that sexual violence policy, and it'd be very interesting to see how we change in our response, or what we should think of the NCAA after that point. So, should the NCAA actually be responsible for regulating sexual violence? Possibly, but before we get to the point of whether it's a yes or a no question, we have to figure out exactly how it should be done, and that's more of a complex issue. We have to look to see what are the resources that are available to the NCAA, or we could see if we're going to potentially change the law to address the issue. The lack of governance when it comes to sexual assault for these governing bodies isn't something that's just simply limited to the NCAA. We see the same thing happening with Olympic sports, particularly as we've seen with USA Gymnastics as well as USA Swimming. So this isn't an issue that's just unique to the NCAA, and that public pressure is actually having an impact, as we've seen with this recent update to the sexual violence policy. Now, whether or not these changes will actually be effective is something that remains to be seen. So it might be something where, the public pressure and getting the institution itself to address its policies would be better or more effective than trying to change the law and enforcing this and making the NCAA subject to Title IX, because they still wouldn't have the ability to directly regulate the schools and universities when it comes to these particular issues. Thank you, and here are my references.